includes Lokendra Purush Dakal, the Executive Director of Center for Nepal State UK, Naresh Kapangi Magar, who is a co-convener, Dr. Susma Basnet, member, and Dr. Sangeeta Shrestha, media coordinator. Nepal Dialogue UK takes place first Saturday of every month at the set fixed time. The format is that we organize distinguished talk 1 month and alternate it with a roundtable panel discussion on the theme of contemporary interest to Nepal and Nepali diaspora. Today we have a talk to be given by Dr. Fraser Sugden. Before I introduce the speaker, let me just remind you about these some of the ground rules and housekeeping so that the event goes smoothly. The talk will be about for 30 minutes, followed by question and answer and comments. All the participants are requested to stay muted at all times, but we encourage your active participation through your questions and comments to be put in our chat box, and from where we will be taking those questions and fielding them. Please name yourself in an identifiable way so that we are sure that there are the human beings there out there ready to take part in the event. The language of today's presentation will be English, but feel free to put your questions and comments in Nepali because our speaker is also capable of understanding Nepali. So let me introduce today's speaker. I'm very pleased to bring today Associate Professor Fraser Sugden, who is a human geographer with PhD on the subject from University of Edinburgh, where he also did his master's. He is a leading agrarian political economist on Nepal, South Asia, and also has done a lot of work on the subject in East Asia. His research basically cross-cuts the class, gender, and generational relations in agriculture with angles on environment and political economy. His extensive ground-based empirical research includes fieldwork in Southeast Asia and South Asia, primarily focused on Nepal and obviously also in India, even China. He has done fieldworks in Vietnam and other places. He worked in Nepal for a long time and being based in Kathmandu and affiliated to International Water Management Institution called UIMI. And there's a number of publications in his record, including his recent work with Suresh Dhakal and Janak Rai, named Agrarian History of Nepal, the Political Economy of Agroecological Change. I've got the book basically here, which I still need to read. He also has published a book named Land, Labor and Agrarian Change in Nepal's Tarai Madhes. The book is here. I hope you can see me. So this makes him one of the most suitable persons to talk about important subject facing Nepal, which is agrarian change, land crisis, and so on. For the next 30 minutes or so, is over to you, Fraser. I mean, maybe I've forgotten that Fraser is Associate Professor at the University of Birmingham. Fraser, over to you.
Sure, thanks a lot, Krishna. Let me just get this up for you now. You can see the slides okay, Krishna, everyone?
Yes. Now
Perfect.
I can see is Facebook Live as well. So good.
Wonderful. Great. Okay, yeah. So, yeah, thanks so much for the invitation. I should probably say, first of all, that this is not I'm not presenting in a particular research project as such. This really is an accumulation of data over like the last 20, 25 years. having worked all across Nepal on different projects related to land, agrarian change, ecological transformation, and so on. So really, I've kind of tried to amalgamate together, and some of this has come out in these two books that Krishna mentioned, but I've kind of really tried to amalgamate, bring together lots of different data sources to try and kind of put together a bit of a narrative. And I actually quite enjoy putting together the talk for today's presentation. In fact, I might even see if I can make turn it into some kind of a publication or something, because it's quite nice to just kind of revisit everything, and look at, what is the big question around land in Nepal. So, in terms of the land question, there is a bit of a narrative which I've kind of noticed quite a lot on the ground, especially in people working in the development sector and stuff like that. I mean, even political actors I've spoken to as well, who sort of think, well, land's not really a big issue anymore in Nepal. People are abandoning agriculture, people are migrating. However, I would probably like to argue that, well, there has been changes in terms of people's engagement with agriculture, but land is still very critical in shaping people's life trajectory, and it is very regionally specific as well. So, in the Tarai, for example, in the Madhesh, then really land is still very, very critical, and for large parts of the peasantry. And the land inequality is very critical in shaping particular structures of opportunity and privilege. Um, and likewise, even in the hills, even in areas where you don't have traditional landlord-tenant relationships, you still this historic legacy of the way in which land, along with other natural resources, were distributed within different communities, still has a really important and critical legacy today. And there's a lot of kind of historical injustices which have yet to be rectified in the hilly regions. So, also, another kind of issue I wanted to kind of tackle today is too often, any kind of analysis of the land issues in Nepal are sort of technocratic, rather than being considered as something which is embedded within much more profound historical processes rooted in Nepal's historic agrarian transition and the sort of interaction between what I call sort of modes of production. And likewise, the kind of there's also a lot of regional variation as well. So the land question in the hills is very different from the land question in the Tarai, and these nuances are often glossed over. So I'm going to start by talking about some of the kind of historical contexts behind land in Nepal, and I think I'd like to start by talking about one of the most fundamental sort of divisions in the history of agriculture. And this is something which, with Janak Rai and Suresh Dakal and I, when we wrote this book on the agrarian history of Nepal, we really kind of brought this division to the fore, and that is the divide between the kind of Adivasi agrarian formation on one hand and the sort of sedentary peasant agriculture or feudal agriculture on the other. Let's start off with what we might call by possibly an Adivasi mode of production. Now, this is really an economic system which is dominated by communal relationships between people and the land, so clan-based, lineage-based land management, and also some tendency for surplus to be redistributed within the larger agricultural community. Now, this was really arguably historically the most important sort of economic system across Nepal, even in, Western Nepal amongst kind of caste communities. So before the Malla Kingdom and, the kind of Middle Ages amongst caste society, plus most of the sort of Tibeto-Burmese speaking Adivasi groups in central and eastern Nepal, agriculture was essentially communal in nature. It was grounded in transhumance, shifting cultivation, and often the cultivation of things like coarse grains, for example, rather than sort of paddy cultivation and paddy culture. Um, and even across the Tarai Madesh as well, although there were some local variations, on the whole, shifting cultivation was still the predominant form of agriculture. And in fact, probably a difference in the Tarai is that possibly the rural kind of clan-based delineation of land was less significant. It was more kind of common property because the population was smaller as well in many of the large forest belts. And this photograph is actually from North Bengal, and this is a kind of Swidden cultivation being carried out in the Tarai forests, which is long dead in Nepal, but it's still persisting in northeast India. So, I mean, this is the kind of agriculture which was carried out, before the Gorkha conquest across the Tarai Madesh. Then on the other hand, you have, what we might call independent peasant farming or even feudal agriculture, the kind of feudal mode of production. And what these two, the peasant and feudal systems have in common is that farming is sedentary. People are farming on the same fixed plot of land. You've got an individualized rather than communal relationship with land. So a tendency, for example, for individual households to have individual plots either through private property or through a tenancy for a landlord. And then you also see this is a much more inequitable agrarian formation. You have a drain of surplus via, taxation and rent. And this is traditionally associated much more strongly with paddy culture. And this is something you see across, South and Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia as well, is division between paddy cultivating ethnic groups and the kind of the minorities in the hills carrying out shifting cultivation. The paddy cultivation is associated with the ability to mobilize labor, with private property, with fixed ownership of land, with feudal kind of ability to, build canals, build infrastructure for paddy cultivation. So, so you've really got these two quite contrasting agrarian systems. In the Tarai Madesh, this was much more limited, except possibly some of the areas around, contemporary Janakpur, the area around the central Tarai Madesh. You had these sort of petty Hindu chieftaincies, which were there before, the Sen Kingdom, before the Gorkha Kingdom, before these larger state formations developed, where it was most likely a sort of sedentary peasant agriculture, a kind of proto-feudal form of farming. The dissolution of the Adivasi mode of production across Nepal and its replacement with sort of sedentary peasant or feudal agriculture is probably one of the most significant changes in Nepal's political economic history. And this echoes a change which has swept the whole of Asia historically. So what is the origins of this change? Well, I mean, I would probably put the origin down to the Khas kingdom, the Khasa empire, which became Sanskritized in the sort of Middle Ages, largely with kind of migration, particularly, or some people expect, many historians have suspected a sort of Rajput migration from the south, which, fed the Sanskritization. It brought in rice culture as well, terracing. So, the caste society, which was previously more of a kind of very, very similar to a lot of the other sort of Adivasi groups in Nepal, much more communal society, became sort of Sanskritized, became sedentarized. And then this, of course, spread westwards. And, particularly in later years, after the kingdom fragmented, you had the petty kingdoms of the Bais and Chalwisi Rajya. And you had, these were often, small states with an often a kind of a tribal periphery, which is living largely autonomously from the state. But then the areas around, so you had these locales of state power around the large forts, around the kind of the palace of the kings, where you would see the kind of these pockets of feudal farming. You would have many caste Hindus, castes who were gradually migrating west as these new kingdoms were formed, and they were carrying out peasant farming, traditional, conventional peasant farming, paying tax to the king. And then you also had certain indigenous, Adivasi groups like Gurung and Magar in particular, who were, at the same time also paying tax to the on these states, and they were becoming kind of feudalized. They were beginning to live on fixed plots of land, abandoning shifting cultivation and abandoning transhumance. So you would see this in areas, places like Palpa, Gulmi, Tanahun, these kind of southern sort of small states where you began to see, even before the Gorkha conquest, the emergence of more hierarchical feudal forms of agriculture. And of course, the Gorkha conquest itself was probably the defining moment because this sort of institutionalized this transition between two forms of agriculture. And it was a real paradigm shift in the relationship between people and land. A much more efficient tax collection apparatus was introduced, much more, rigorous records on who owned what land were introduced. And there was a huge effort to kind of clear the forest frontier and settle land and bring land which was previously under shifting cultivation under fixed tax-paying farming. So the dissolution of the Adivasi mode of production is not restricted to Nepal. My colleague Kumar Sanjay Singh, who's at Delhi University, who's been working on this topic with me, has also documented this change in central India as well. But really, there's kind of three processes of dissolution. The first is taxation, introducing heavy taxes, which undermines the ability of surplus to be retained within this sort of clan-based or tribal unit. You have the creation of an indigenous functionary class, so chieftains who are given functionary roles. Now, this is something this happened everywhere, even in Scotland in the Middle Ages. Chiefs were given functionary roles. They emerged into landlords over time. They went from being tribal chiefs to becoming landlords. Then you have, of course, the clearing of the forest frontier, the introduction of private property rights, or even if they're not private property rights, the introduction of kind of fixed titles to land, even if the state is the ultimate landlord. But clearing of forests was very, very important, and this they also drive to bring in rice cultivating farmers from other parts of the country to settle on new lands and expand the tax-paying net to wider parts of the country. This drives sedentarization, and also as there's less and less forest, undermines shifting cultivation, as there's less sort of common land to go around. Oh, sorry, I'm struggling to move on to the next slide here. Give us a second. That's it. Yeah. So, in the plains, you saw probably one of the most rapid transformations. I mean, you saw the complete clearing of the forest frontier in a very, very short period of time, and the consolidation of feudalism, particularly due to the Zimidari system and also the distribution of Birta grants. Then, um, so in the 19th century, you really had two kind of types of landlord, and particularly in the lowlands, you had the sort of the functionaries who'd been given the tax collecting role, like the zimindars, who were drawn from the indigenous elite. And then you also had the sort of recipients of land grants, so the recipients of Birta grants. And these were people largely of hill descent who had estates in the Terai. And in the peasantry themselves, they were either tenants on these landed estates, or they were sort of tenants for landlords, or they were tax-paying independent farmers. But at the end of the day, the surplus would go to the state. Um, and then, this is the Molpot office in a village in Morang. This is where the farmers would come and deposit their tax, their share of the harvest. In the hills, you had a much more complex transition. You had a more decentralized tax collection apparatus, which meant that you didn't have you didn't have so many big landlord estates like you did in the plains. There was also a very different political settlement between the state and the indigenous groups of the hills, particularly in places like Limbuwan, for example. The military need to kind of maintain the loyalty of clan chiefs was more important than generating revenue from the land. So that was the origin essentially of the Kipat system, where the state basically preserved indigenous land, sort of communal lands, in return for loyalty. However, over time, as the military need to pacify indigenous chieftains declined, then the desire to hold on to the Kipat system also declined. So that's when you gradually then see the abolition of Kipats, which happened first amongst the Tamang, then later amongst the Limbu, which really kind of went in line with wherever the state, as the state's power expanded, you saw Kipat rights eventually being abolished, and you began to see this in-migration of hill castes, and often the sort of the clearing of some of the best land for paddy cultivation, and then the pushing of the Adivasi onto the kind of more marginal land higher up. Another important thing in the hills was probably it was labor rather than tax, which was the primary form of surplus appropriation. So particularly forced labor, jara, begar, that was probably as significant as the crop share in terms of a way of extracting surplus from the hills, partly because land is also more marginal and there's fewer returns. Um, and I think the legacy of the sort of dissolution of the Adivasi mode of production in the hills, which largely was dissolved by the kind of Panchayat period, the legacy though still persists in terms of the kind of geography of inequality. And you really see this in areas such as the sort of Tamang homelands, where you really have the best paddy lands are predominant, and even across eastern Nepal, the best paddy lands you will see predominantly, Nepali speaking Brahmin and Chetri castes who have, historically moved in and taken these lands. And then the hill slopes and higher land, particularly the rain-fed land, you have a much greater number of indigenous communities there. But you do also get pockets of kind of landlord-tenant relations in the valleys. So, I mean, a number of the valleys we visited, the sort of Besi lands in eastern Nepal, we saw, actually classic feudalism. The places we visited, like one of the valleys we worked in Bhojpur, you had, essentially absentee landlords who lived in Biratnagar and other places, and they still had these lands. And it was mainly actually not indigenous groups from the area, but groups such as Magar, Maji, you also had Hill Dalits as well, who are farming these lands as tenants. So you have this kind of really kind of complex and quite mixed agricultural system in the hills. Another kind of major change, which is worth touching upon, is that in the 1900s, between the 1900s and 1950s, land tax lost its significance as a form of surplus appropriation. The government had other sources of revenue, but what you began to see was that landlords began to fill the gap. So you saw landlords rather than the state emerging as the main appropriator of surplus. And this was a South Asia-wide process of change. But this also is empowering for small individual proprietors. So those who were tax-paying peasants, particularly in the hills, they were not able to retain their surplus. But those who were working as tenants for other landlords, or then they were the ones who had then ended up, rather than paying tax, they were paying rent instead. So, looking into the 60s, Patriot era, modernization, land reform, what did this mean for these historic land relations? Well, again, one of the biggest changes, of course, was the colonization of the forest frontier. The state sponsored a resettlement of the Terai. That saw the emergence of a powerful kind of owner cultivating class. These were farmers who had their own land, fertile land. Then you see this sort of prosperous settler belt in the north of the Terai who are sort of freed from the shackles of feudalism. But then further south, you saw the consolidation of feudalism in the Terai. Land reforms were not that successful. They often saw the landlord as being the primary beneficiary. Confirmation of titles, many of the were able to bypass the reforms. And in many ways, in places like Donisha, for example, this was kind of in oral histories we collected. This was really the heyday of feudalism. Really, they spoke about a period when they were young. Many of our respondents who were children in the 60s, spoke about really kind of extreme forms of feudal bondage. Interlinked contracts, usury, concentration of land amongst a tiny elite. And then in places like Morang, the kind of the tribal belt of the Terai, also similar in places like Dang, the Dang Valley, for example, you had the indigenous Tharu landlords, many who've actually lost their land in the land reforms because they didn't have those political connections. And you saw the emergence of the old Birta recipients and the kind of hill origin landlord class began to emerge as the most powerful landed elite. Um, they often moved to the town, these landlords. They were often linked to the bureaucracy or political parties. A lot of political leaders, for example, had feudal estates in the Moran countryside, even today. And of course, they're hanging on to this land because this land also has value now. This is a fertile district. This is close to industrial development, close to a city. So you have this really bizarre bizarre convergence between feudal rent seeking and kind of capitalist rent seeking, whereby people are holding on to land for speculative value while extracting surplus from the farmers who are living on that land. In the hills, I say the situation is different. Um, Despite the fact that you have greater land ownership, distribution is still unequal, so there is still inequality, and particularly a kind of ethnic and caste-based inequality in the hills. And of course, there was new stresses in the 60s as kind of cultivation was reaching the limits of expansion. So you had a more of a problem with productivity, small marginal holdings, insufficient land really to go around. Um, And this rose, rising articulation of capitalism, rising articulation with capitalism through wage labor, and particularly the porterage economy, which those of you who traveled in the hills in the 90s and early thousands will remember was still very common. People would earn money carrying goods up into the villages from the towns, and this was the way through which capitalism penetrated these remote communities. You also had very, very high migration emerging in this period, particularly in Western Nepal, which is where the kind of land to people ratio was sort of most constrained. Um, so what is the kind of contemporary land question today? So in the Terai Madesh, I through our research probably identified three distinct trajectories of change. Now, the first trajectory is we have, a perpetuation of quite kind of classic forms of feudalism. Now, I'd say this is probably less common. This is much more common in Bihar, for example, to the south. But this is where you've got dominance of a small, locally resident landlord class usually upper caste, generally descendants from the old tax collectors. And this is kind of, you only really see this in Nepal in some pockets, particularly the Koshi floodplains, for example. It's quite common around certain parts of Saptari. There's a very, very fertile belt where you have, large tenant class, predominantly from the Dalit community, or what they call in India OBCs, other backward castes. Large land holdings amongst landlords of, 10 hectares or more, sharecropping, and very limited access to irrigation water, sort of control of agricultural equipment by landlords. Koiladi in Saptari was probably the only village where we really saw this taking place in practice. He had a very powerful Rajput landowning class and mostly Dalit and Danuk tenants. And you even had things like corvée labor, where tenants were expected to work for landlords, for to give free labor, 2, 3 days of free labor a month for landlords. So, but this is, I'd say, declining. It's much greater in India. In India, in a village we've been working for years in Madhubani, Mahawahi, you have 62% of the land is rented from landlords. So 62% of the land belongs to one kind of group of families. So you really see, and you still see a lot of usury and money lending, but it is changing even in these contexts. Interlinked contracts is much less common, whereby, farmers who are bonded through debt to landlords. Often the landlords are separate from the money lenders. They're still being exploited, but they're not kind of locked into these same contracts. And there's also kind of rising assertiveness of tenants. Tenants are kind of, less willing to, they've been empowered through migration, through access to media and knowledge. They no longer, there's that sort of subservience is gone. The second trajectory is where you've seen the decline in the landlord class. So in some areas, particularly Danusha, and in fact much of Madhesh, actually much of the kind of core Madhesh, or what we might call Madhesh province, you don't really have the Madheshi landlord class really is fragmented and dissolved to a large extent in the last sort of 30 to 40 years. During the People's War, for example, in Danusha, a lot of the old landlords sold off their land. Um, and there was also, people, these were remote districts, the land didn't have much value, so people got rid of their estates. However, the beneficiaries were not the tenants. The beneficiaries were the middle to large farmers. So you had, Yadav middle farmers who were buying up land from Brahmin landlords who were abandoning their land. Whereas to the case of the Dalits, they remain the same. And who are actually the majority in the Tarai are Dalit. Madheshi Dalits, essentially their lives remained almost the same. In fact, for some of them, the land ownership was actually getting worse. So just to give an example, one of the four Danisha villages we looked at, 76% have less than 1 hectare of land, but there's not a big landlord class, but there is a notable what we might call a large farmer class, and you've still got over a third of the land which is under tenancy. Now, the third trajectory in the Tara is when you see consolidation of absentee landlordism. I touched upon this already. You really see this a lot in the sort of Tharu, Rajbanshi, the kind of Adivasi belt of the Tarai. This is where you've got the biggest legacy of the Rana era Birta distribution system, giving out the Birta grants. Here you have absentee landlordism. You've got, and in this case, liberalization, monetization of the economy has actually encouraged a perpetuation of landlordism. Whereas in somewhere like Danisha, it's hastened its decline. So you've got this strange kind of irony between these two different trajectories of change. So in this case, because these are districts which are generally more fertile, wealthier, they're closer to political power, places like Chitwan, Bardia, um, the Dan Valley, comparatively to somewhere like Danusha, are actually relatively more prosperous. You got high land values, better irrigation, and there are fewer incentives of landlords to sort of sell off their estates in this case. And in fact, in our sample in Morang district, the rents were actually increasing. They'd increased from around 18 mon of paddy per biga to around 25 mon per biga, just in the 10, 15 years between when I started fieldwork and finished fieldwork. So you're really seeing the complete squeezing of the peasantry in this area. Talahav, Morang, one of the field sites here, 78.82% of land is under tenancy, and three-quarters belongs to absentee landlords who mainly live in Kathmandu and Biratnagar, and they have absolutely zero productive investment with the land at all. It's an entirely extractive relationship. To give an example of what happens to surplus, for example, so After the farmers have cultivated rice and wheat, only 35% of the grain amongst landless tenants remains with the household. 40% goes as rent to the landlord. 16% is through distress commerce. So that's when farmers, sell their crop to repay loans taken prior to the harvest. And 10% goes for paying for things like a threshing machine, irrigation or whatever, payment in kind for services. So you really see the drain on livelihoods, which has been created by landlordism in this context. And in fact, the amount of grain retained by the household we estimated was 110 kilograms per capita, whereas the annual estimated per capita grain needs is 318 kilograms. So you're seeing really here that that most landless farmers are well, all landless farmers basically are chronically food insecure. So, another important thing to note is that for all three trajectories, tenancy is on the rise. The panel data we did between 2007 and 2019 in Morang suggested that percent of land under tenancy was 59% in 2007, and it had increased to 64% by 2019. Rent had increased, I said already, from 18 to 25 to 31 per biga. And even in Danisha, we don't have big landlords, but landlessness is still increasing. The percent who are landless had increased from 25% in 2013 and 29% in 2021, according to our own panel data set. So what about the hills? And this is kind of coming to the last section of the presentation. Land inequality is still a real and present challenge in the hills, so we shouldn't think it's irrelevant. And you see a lot of distressed sales of land, particularly linked to the migration economy. But I think a bigger issue in the hills is not so much inequality in land, but the fact that land holdings are small, they're fragmented, there are few resources, irrigation is poor, and also, you see, the primary drain of surplus really is not through rent, feudal rent, but it's really through migrant labor and the kind of exploitation associated with the migration economy. Give an example is the Chirkuwa Valley, a valley in Bhojpur we've been working in since 2013. This is sort of near the Dingla area of Bhojpur and the sort of edge of the Arun Valley. So we sampled three villages, and we've been working in these three villages for a while now. The very top of the valley, a place called Gufagaon and Kimalung. Here you've got very marginal land, farmed mostly by the Tamang and Sherpa community. Very small holders, majority is less than 1 hectare, but majority is also barry land, so it's rain-fed, only really one harvest a year. Here they're heavily dependent on migration, a huge level of exploitation by agents, through middlemen, through cheating. Nearly every other household we met had some kind of negative migration experience. Yeah, Sanrang, which is the kind of the Rai domain and the sort of center of the valley. Here also it's a more mixed economy. You've got a mix of smallholder cultivation. People. This was an area where most of the Kipat land. A lot of this Kipat land was seized in the 60s, mostly by upper castes. And you've got a lot of tenancy for Brahmin landlords, and this is the kind of legacy of the Kipat abolition. But it's not the only, it's not the majority of farmers. It's probably around about a third of the farmers who are working as kind of tenants, but most of them are just smallholders cultivating quite marginal plots of land. And then on the low altitude valley floor, the two villages we looked at down right near the base of the Arun River, here you've actually got very classical, almost Tarai style feudalism, where you had, big politically powerful absentee landlords. Most of them were from the same community. They were based originally in Dingla, the market, and now they lived in Biratnagar and Kathmandu. And it was mainly Dalit and Magar tenants here. And 80% of the land was under 1 hectare, and a third of the land was under tenancy. And what was quite disturbing in this village was that this village in particular had been targeted by corrupt agents recently. So a lot of people had been gone abroad on kind of false contracts from this village and had ended up in huge debt, and a lot of them had sold off their land. So it was almost like the agents sort of find pockets of vulnerability and then target them. Um, and what was also interesting, if you want a reminder of the relevance of land in shaping so many different aspects of livelihoods, is that looking at the level of remittances according to land ownership was quite significant. So those who had between 1 and 2 hectares of land, the kind of the middle farmers, were earning more than almost 3 times the farmers who earned 0.25 hectares of land. And now all these migrants were traveling to the Gulf, but it was really because the Dalit tenants, the Mughal tenants, those who had very, very marginal holdings, were often targeted by corrupt agents. They also were more likely to go into menial labor. Those who had a bit of land, a bit of connections, were more likely, a bit higher levels of education, were more likely to um, get kind of better paid, sort of semi-skilled jobs or service sector jobs overseas. And the reason that the bigger landowners have lower remittances is actually an anomaly because there was only about two or three wealthy farmers in the sample. So I wouldn't read too much into that. But plus, they're kind of less. A lot of these people were the farmers at home were less dependent on receiving remittances because they were wealthier. So that's also why the remittance inflow is shown as being lower. Trends in land ownership, even in the hills, area under tenancy remains unchanged, but there is a notable increase in the number of farmers who are landless. It was about 4 or 5% had increased. There was also growing agrarian stress here. Again, the most menial forms of migrant labour were amongst the most marginal landholders. But also a lot of distress sales, so people selling land due to crises, um, usually associated with migration. So in Nepal, the latest National Living Standard survey suggests that 36.4% of farmers in Nepal of rural households in Nepal are landless. And this has gone up from 16.9% in 1995. So across the board, landlessness is increasing. And this is driven by distressed sale of land, fragmentation amongst families, the fact that plots are becoming smaller and smaller and less viable. But I think any kind of future land reform needs to match the diverse ground realities. Redistributive land reform is still a major priority, particularly in the Tarai Madesh, although the signs that the current government has any commitment to this is quite uncertain. I mean, one of the first things which the new government did was abolish the Land Commission. And these are kind of quite inexplicable policy decisions. I think it more reflects the fact that it's just not considered a priority at all by any of the kind of Kathmandu-focused political actors. Um, so land reform is still a priority, particularly in the Tarai. In the hills, there are areas where there is still scope for land reforms, particularly some of the lower valleys. I mean, I think a bigger challenge really here is about small and marginal holdings. And this is linked in part to the sort of historic injustices which remain addressed, such as the alienation of communal lands, but also the fact that the land to people ratio is so much more constrained in the hills. So, there are alternative solutions, collective farms, extensive investment in irrigation, consolidation of land, and developing the non-farm sector. Whereas in the Tarai, the priority really needs to be redistribution. We're also, we've been experimenting in India and Sub-Saharan of Nepal with, group farming. So encouraging marginal landholders to sort of consolidate their land and form larger units. This is the kind of initiative which could have some potential in the hills. And even in the plains, after redistribution of land, if there was land reforms in the future, then there's potential not to give it to individual farmers, but to give it to collectives who can then run these sort of small scale group farms. So far, our results have been really promising in terms of productivity and the benefits of farmers working together in terms of access to inputs and development of the productive forces. I think also, you know, but this is an opportune moment for political change. There has been a political movement, has been a change of government in Nepal. People are empowered. However, unfortunately, it's been very much urban centric. Um, any future land reform really needs to go with a grassroots mobilization, and that's what Nepal hasn't seen. There's not been a concerted political effort to mobilize the peasantry at the grassroots. If you look at one of the most successful land reforms in the world, which was Operation Barga, which took place in West Bengal in the 1970s, the reason it was successful was that it was matched with a grassroots campaign. There was no chance for landlords to use their political influence to bypass the reforms because there was a genuine commitment for reform right from the centre down to the grassroots cadre in the villages. And that is why, the farmers were mobilised. They were made sure to make sure that landlords were not able to play the system, avoid the reform. But I think more than that, it was driven by a kind of core commitment by the government at that particular time to redistribute land. So I think on that note, I'll wind up, and I'm happy to open this up to some discussion.
Okay, thank you. Let me just speakers. Okay. Thank you, Fraser. This is such a rich and illuminating talk spanning, 500 years of agrarian history to, contemporary issues. Uh, the on land, which obviously is the still one of the most prominent, uh, subject in Nepal, as we are still, I think, regarded as the Krishi Pradhan Desh. Uh, I have uh, a few questions. You can also look at them in the chat so that it will becomes easier. Uh, to start with, I think with the Bose Baral's question, which came first, but also to start with the a little bit clarification about the Adivasi, non-Adivasi mode of productions and context.
Yeah.
So his belief that the village, one way of living, farming and owning land, maybe there's some similarity or something. And that brings to my curiosity about this idea of uh, Adivasi versus Raithane, or the local. The local is, in various aspect, cultural aspect, is very much shared one. So maybe do you want to highlight a little bit on this one first before we can
Sorry, so
further?
which question is the first question here in the chat?
Yes, yes.
Hmm.
The classification between Adivasi and non-Adivasi in agrarian context, is that obvious in Nepal?
Well, that's the thing because there isn't really an Adivasi mode of production in Nepal anymore. You see convergence by the 1960s and 70s between Adivasi and non-Adivasi forms of agriculture. You see, I think there was probably a lot of borrowing of sort of Adivasi systems by non-Adivasi historically, but at the same time, Adivasi has borrowed from the non-Adivasi in terms of, terraced agriculture, rice cultivation. So really, this kind of distinction becomes less relevant. But I think where you really see it is probably in terms of the population distribution and the distribution of natural resources within many of the hill valleys where you really do see the very best paddy lands is predominantly farmed by upper castes. In eastern Nepal, you will very rarely find Rai Limbu communities living in the valleys. On the kind of the kind of prime agricultural land. So I think this is where, but I think that yeah, we can't really differentiate between sort of Adivasi and non-Adivasi agriculture today. There are some legacies in terms of certain practices, certain indigenous knowledges, certain crops which are favored, but you can't really. So I think, I mean, I agree. It's not really because what I'm talking about is historical change, is a massive historical divergence. Um, and I should also say the concept of Adivasi mode of production is something we're still working on. We're not even sure if that's even the right term because it's a form of agriculture which isn't just restricted to Adivasi. So it's something which is a work in progress, and we're hoping with my colleagues in Delhi, we're planning to kind of develop a new edited volume on this topic sometime over the next year or two, which will try and flesh out some of these questions.
Okay, great. Thank you. While I would like to encourage all our participants, we have time for some discussion, so please feel free to put your questions and comments into our chat box. More or
Yeah.
less, you have answered this question. I mean, more recently,
Go on.
Nepal's social media, Facebook's, has been
Aye.
a site for various cultural claims and counterclaims. As you have pointed that the migration of rice plantation. I have also seen quite recently that the community like Limbus and maybe rice, they used to have this kind of rice plantation tradition in the past, which is goes quite contrary to
Mm.
my understanding.
I,
Maybe
I,
do you have any information on this one?
I'm not. I mean, I'm aware that there was sort of Gaya dance. There was like dry rice,
I see.
and that's common across Southeast Asia amongst sort of Tibeto-Burmese speaking ethnic groups. Like Hmong communities, for example, you see across Laos and northern Thailand. So it was present in Nepal, and it was a lot of sources by in the kind of Hodgson archives and stuff, they spoke about this, the Gaiadan cultivation has been quite common amongst indigenous groups in the hills. But that's different from, that's not terraced rice farming. That is farming rice in the same way you farm millet, where you sort of direct seeding, and it's a different type of rice. There may have been, there could well have been forms of terraced paddy cultivation. We don't really know. It wasn't the predominant form of agriculture, but it may have existed earlier, and that's why it's really difficult to say. Because I would expect that there was definitely paddy cultivation in Limbuan before the Gurkha conquest. Around the Sen Kingdom, there was Jagier distribution.
Yes.
So there were still pockets of kind of sedentary feudal farming around the larger towns, places like Kadabari, Chainpur, where you had sort of centers of state power. I would have expected there was definitely paddy cultivation before the Gurkha conquest, but it really just and yeah, there would have been indigenous communities I'm sure would have borrowed as well. But it's again without there's so few documentary sources, it's difficult. You have to base them on speculation. There's also a couple of questions from
Yes,
Lakshya
let
Gurung
me
and
maybe
David
moderate
also.
those three. Yes, there's one before we go into the on the question raised by David. Let's take this question from Councillor Lakshya Gurung
So yeah, so so
about your
Councillor Gurung's question.
source of data,
Yep.
and also I would like to just piggyback my own about on the
Mhm.
size of sample you have on this relationship between landholding and remittance in Nepal.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this was must have been around about 150 households in Bhojpur, but we also did the same sample in Danusha, again around 130 households, and the results were the same. And the survey we did in Bhojpur was also a panel data. So we'd done the same survey in 2015, and we did it again in 2021 after the pandemic, and it was a similar relationship. So I think we have some confidence that this is reliable. Um, and in terms of as Councillor Gurnan's question more broadly around data, this is all our own survey data. So this is surveys we did. So we did this, for example, we've got all those case studies I gave at the end were places we've done surveys. So, for example, we did a survey in about 6 villages in Donisha. Sample size. Was probably around 400 or 500. Then we did a survey in Saptari, around 1,500 households. We did a census actually, so that Koiladi village, we surveyed the entire village, and we even mapped to the landowners where the land was and so on. In Bhojpur, we did a sample again. It was the same sample around about 130 to 150 households, and we did it in 2015 again in 2021. So yes, this is basically all our own data.
Yeah, I think your sample size is fairly large, so I think
Yeah.
there's big confidence on the result.
Yeah, I think and I think regarding remittance and fairly, we have a lot of confidence in the data because we've done the same survey again.
Okay, let's look at the question posed by David. I'm also going
Yeah.
to read because people
Hmm.
I mean, watching it on a regular live might not see them later. So the
Hmm.
big contrast between AMP, Adivasi
Hmm.
mode of production, and FMP,
Hmm.
whatever
Hmm.
it says, you understand, is powerful.
Yep.
But
Yep.
what do we do with the fact that many indigenous groups had internal hierarchies even before the process of feudalization began? In
Hmm.
other words, the egalitarian ethos can be exaggerated and
Yeah.
romanticized. On your
Yeah.
final point about Operation Bharga,
Hmm.
Bharga,
Hmm.
are there not critics of it, suggesting that it was
Yes.
not as successful or beneficial in the long term as it is often
Hmm.
represented?
Yep. I think the first question is really important because this is one of the things that my colleagues like Suresh and my colleague Sanjay and I are trying to kind of work on in this sort of discussion paper on sort of Adivasi mode of production. Absolutely, there was definitely hierarchies, and I think it's very important not to romanticize sort of indigenous modes of production. I mean, if you look at the many of the concepts which have been used to develop this idea of kind of Adivasi modes of production actually originated in West Africa, particularly the kind of Francophone colonies of West Africa, work done by the radical anthropologists, people like Claude Messieu and people in the 60s, Pierre Philippe Ray. who were kind of radical Marxist anthropologists. And many of these studies actually showed these modes of production were not at all equitable. In fact, many of these modes of production were also tied in with slavery as well and the supply of slaves. So, there was a really dark side behind many of these modes of production. As well as the fact there was a strong communal element, there was redistribution of surplus, there was. So I think it's not romanticizing. I think it's more the way in which surplus is distributed is different. So certainly in amongst, for example, Rai and Limbu communities, for example. Yeah, of course, there was like Suba, there was the chieftain, and there would have been accumulation of surplus. But I think the difference possibly between a feudal system is that you have accumulation of surplus, but then you also have sort of redistribution, customary redistribution, not necessarily through giving out. And I think redistribution doesn't necessarily happen through, the chief going and distributing grain to those who need it, but it would take place through, feasts, through communal events. Um, and you see this across, tribal and clan-based societies. In Scotland, for example, also, there was definitely tribal elements. There was redistribution of wealth, but there was still a clear landed elite. Okay, even if the land belonged to the clan, there was an accumulating elite, you might say, whereby who accumulated wealth, and this wealth was redistributed largely through communal activities. So I think, yeah, I completely agree that there was definitely hierarchies within indigenous modes of production. I think the what is important is how the external state is able to harness these hierarchies for their own benefit and sort of feudalize essentially to these indigenous systems. And then again, and the kind of path-breaking study from West Africa back in the 60s really showed how the colonialism was able to harness some of these internal divisions and perpetuate them and create a kind of a landed elite. So they went from being a kind of an indigenous elite within a tribal system, which also was not very equitable, to becoming a kind of indigenous elite within a capitalist colonial system. Um,
Okay. We
yeah.
have a few questions.
And I, on Varga as well.
Yes. Okay. Go. Yeah. Go
Yeah,
for
well,
it.
I mean, again, yeah, I think you're right, David. I think there were, I think certainly the parts of West Bengal we have worked in, it has been successful in North Bengal, but but there will be pockets, I'm sure, where there was harnessing of, I mean, I think I know this really from comparing West Bengal and Bihar. The difference, they were very similar in the 60s, and now it's completely transformed, and a lot of that transformation is down to Varga.
Right. Okay. I think somebody's mic is on mute, so I need to mute it. BK Parazuliji. Yeah, I think he's maybe looking as he can do it. Thank you. We'll enter to the question about the current problems and solutions. There are a few questions on those, but before we go into that one, there's a question by Lokendra Dakal on
Hmm.
the mountain agriculture. Uh,
Yes.
it says your presentation, maybe your research touched on hill and Madhes, the Tarai, if you like. But he says, I understand the mountain agriculture are somewhat different to the
Yes.
lowlands.
Yeah, so that's again, I didn't really get a chance to say in the introduction, but in our book on agricultural history, we do make it very clear that we don't really cover the mountains. Um, it's Firstly, it's only 5% of the population really who are about that, who live in like the sort of true mountains, the high altitude valleys. Um, yeah, and it is different. I think we touched upon it a few times in the book, but I think there's two. It's very like you said, livelihoods are completely different, much more based upon pastoralism, transhumance, trade, and now tourism as well. So we haven't really talked about mountains, and we were quite open about that in the book also that we don't really cover the kind of high mountain areas. The two areas we didn't really cover was the Kathmandu Valley and the high mountains. Kathmandu Valley just because there's already so much on it and because it's a world to itself, it's so different. And also the mountains because it would be a whole other book just to bring in the mountains because it's so different. Yeah.
Okay, great. Uh, there's a question by Kes Bahadur Pariyar about, it's a very big question to tackle. Maybe, you have already
Yes.
said something about it, but how to change old traditional agricultural system in Nepal, especially Dalit community are landless. Uh, so I think the issue of Dalit came in part of your presentation, both in Tarai and Eastern Hill.
Yeah, I maybe need a bit more clarity what the kind of on the question there. So how do you change?
Yeah, I think this is a very vague question. Was traditional agricultural system? I think it's also changing in a
Mhm,
various ways. As you have seen, shown three different uh, paradigms of shift, if you
mhm.
like. Maybe Kes Badriji can write more. But the question of Dalit being landless, can that be somehow addressed? Something?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I mean that's again like so. A majority of Hill Dalits at least are landless. I mean, in all of our study sites, they're also a relatively small population, at least in the areas where we worked. But I think that's yeah. So you see. Yeah, again, another thing, a question for land reform, I think in the future is that any land reform also needs to address the issue of Dalit landlessness in the hills. So, although they're not, so the issue, for example, in the Terai, for example, many of these villages in the Terai, you've got, you know, 90% of tenants are landless. Sorry, 90% of the tenants are Dalits and are landless. And they're also like 40-50% of the population in many of these villages. So you can see the clear and present benefits of redistributive land reform for the Dalit community. And in the hills also, although the Dalit population is much, much smaller, so you're talking about, 10% in some villages, less, something a bit more. It's important that land reform in the hills doesn't say, oh, well, land reform is not an issue in the hills. They have to, of course, remember you have the Dalit community, has you have this kind of intergenerational historic injustices which need to be addressed. So land reform needs to be much more focused and much more targeted in these pockets where you've got, high population of Dalit, but also these pockets where you've got these kind of localized feudal relationships and persistence of kind of Jajmani systems, like in Western Nepal, parts of the Western Hills, for example. Yeah.
Right. Okay. On this idea of the problems and solutions that we're facing in this field. Bisho others, Pandit has asked, what do you think about the idea of distribution of uncultivated land to the poor? Many
Mhm.
Nepalese have migrated to overseas and their land is left uncultivated for
Yeah.
years. Don't you think this could be a good idea to lessen poverty and prevail equity? But what could be, have you seen any solutions to this one?
Yeah.
Have you found anything that could be
Yeah. No,
big
I think it's a really, I
policy?
think the question of uncultivated land is really, really good. I do personally think the question of uncultivated land is overpushed a little bit in the media sort of popular narrative because certainly the areas we worked, there's very little uncultivated land. The only land we saw which was uncultivated, which land was land which really was you couldn't produce on it. I mean, there was land, for example, in our field site in Doti, for example, there was some land which for the irrigation, the water situation was so bad, it was quite high altitude it just really wasn't even worth cultivating anymore, particularly under the current climatic situation. But I've seen very little land which has actually been abandoned, but what I have seen is a changing land use. So a move towards agroforestry, so people planting trees on the land, utis, for example, which is quite profitable. In Bhojpur, a lot of farmers who'd migrated were now cultivating utis on their land and they're often the grandparents were kind of staying in the village, keeping an eye on it. So I'm a bit wary about talking about abandoned land, but I do think that there is land, there is definitely land which is unused. And again, yeah, any land reform needs to identify land which is unused. I mean, my personal opinion, I think the a system which worked better in Nepal is the Chinese system, where land is managed by the commune at the village level, if somebody leaves the village, then the land goes back into the pool and is given to someone else who needs it. So really, I mean, ideally, I think land should be managed as it's managed in China and Vietnam and other ex-socialist countries. Land essentially belongs to the community, and those who need the land farm it. If a businessman wants to come in and set up a plantation, they can, but they need to lease the land off the farmers. You know, they need to lease the land, sorry, off the village. So I think, that's a way of making sure the resources from land are not drained away.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Obviously, I think this is a huge issue in the middle of Nepal.
Mhm.
I think the large chunk, significant share, we can say now, has gone
Yes.
barren. And of course, the wood and bushes that come up, and you can say that's been converted to forest, but obviously not on purpose.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is a huge issue. I think that
Yeah.
cannot
And I
be
think it varies by I
cannot be
think
ignored.
it
Cannot be
varies by
ignored in
part of the
any
country
study.
as well.
Yeah, any
Yeah.
studies on the agrarian change or
Mm.
anything. Anyway, I think this is something for you to look at in the
Mm.
future, and for all of us. And you pointed about the the Chinese practices of communal practice. That brings us to Vishnu Surface Pro. I hope this is Vishnu Raj Upreti again. I'm not sure. Vishnu
Mm.
Raj Upreti once, in his Facebook post, had written that there should be some way of inheritance tax, making land
Yep.
centralizing land in a way through various means, so that this can be used in more productively.
Yep.
Anyway,
Yep.
let's look at this question here. I think this also
Yes.
talks about some
Very
collective
good
farming.
question. Yep.
Many thanks for sharing very impressive presentation on Nepal's agrarian reform and recent changes. What particular model of collective farming you intend to suggest here? Is it in the form of a cooperative farming, as suggested by some of the Maoist party leaders, or big consolidated families,
Mhm.
whole farming? You might also want to highlight changes in agriculture extension service delivery system over the past 20
Mhm.
years or so, especially after
Mhm.
1990s political change. Apologies for the long question. Maybe I think it's interesting.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So this is a whole separate project which I could have given another presentation on, but are the pilot collective farms we've established are actually based upon four models. So I should outline the key principles. We've been doing it mainly in India, actually in West Bengal and Bihar, and we did have a pilot in Nepal, but that's finished now due to lack of funds that couldn't continue. But we're still doing the work in India, and the way it works is we generally have groups of around 10 to 15 farmers, so relatively modest. So this is totally different from like a sort of Soviet style collective, which were thousands of farmers, and they failed because they were just too big and bureaucratic. So margin small, up to 10 households, up to kind of, 2 to 3 hectares of land. Two different models. One model is whereby farmers voluntarily pool their land, and then this land is farmed by the collective unit. And the other model is a kind of leasehold model that you mentioned, whereby you lease land off landowners, and then the land is then given to farmers to farm collectively. If farmers are not happy about pooling their labor, then there are also hybrid models whereby they can, for example, separate the land into subplots. They can manage irrigation communally. They can manage ploughing communally, land preparation. They can even market the produce communally, but each household is responsible for their own individual plot. So there's essentially like three different models there you can play around with. This is what you can do now at present, but ideally after a land reform, then I think there's a huge scope to set up small scale collectives and give land not to individual farmers rather than having 15 farmers farming zero point 0.2 hectare, have a group of farmers who are farming as a collective enterprise, 1.5, 2 hectares, 3 hectares of land. They can have other livelihoods on the side, but then they can also have the kind of a group farm where land is much more productively used. An agricultural extension service delivery system. Yeah, I mean, I could cover that. In the book, actually, we cover that a lot. We look at the changes and the introduction of agricultural extension and so on. So I probably it's a bit too much to go into right now. But
Mm,
yeah, but that's also really that's something we do cover a lot in the book.
yes. I think this very nicely links to the question Edwin has asked,
Mhm.
linking agriculture to agriculture drive to migration here. To what extent
Mhm.
does change in agriculture drive labor migration, and to what extent is the other way around, the socio-economic growth of the labor migration drives agriculture change?
Yeah.
Obviously, the various research we have done and other people have done shows that the
Mhm.
younger generations are not interested
Yep.
in the traditional occupations, including agriculture, and this in a
Yeah.
large scale. So I think the question of migration is very huge here.
Hmm.
What do you want to say on it?
Hmm. Yep. I think it's both, but I'd say probably. So we actually just finished a Horizon project, 4 year project on the impact of migration on agricultural land use change. And actually, our finding was that it's really quite that the other way around is much more significant. So agricultural stress is driving migration, but migration's impact on agricultural change is much more limited. The only kind of a fun, so I mean, I wouldn't say I'm very wary of talking about climate-induced migration, but what is certainly clear is that agriculture is becoming less productive, less profitable, climate stresses as well. Again, land inequality, you have unviable plots, so migration almost is essential. Household cannot subsist anymore on agriculture alone. So agriculture provides some of the food, migration provides the cash. I mean, that's basically the way that most livelihoods in Nepal are structured today. um is migration impacting land use change? A little bit, but I wouldn't say it's certainly in our field sites it's not that significant. Possibly like one of the things they've shifted towards agroforestry, for example. Some demographic change, so wealthier farmers, young people moving to the town, and then possibly the land at home being managed by the grandparents. So that's also quite common. You see a bit of demographic shift, so generational shift in agriculture. But otherwise, not massive. I wouldn't say the changes were nothing like as significant as we had thought compared to some of the other countries in that study. Other countries, there were huge impacts of migration on agriculture, but not so much in Nepal.
All right. Okay. Let's take this final question. I think let's make this final.
From
And we
Bina?
are really doing very well in terms of time. Also discussion, I think. Oh, maybe there's one more question from, we can take these two and
Yes.
then that will be the final two. Okay. One, Bina Kapung's question about the landless, the Dalit benefited uh,
Yeah,
any kind in increase the opportunities due to the migration. That's one question. And obviously, we have seen this wave in Kaski and around.
yeah,
So the second, Lakshya Gurung again asking, you must be aware that a lot of poor people migrate to cities and towns, especially during the Maoist insurgency time in Nepal. Hence, there are a lot of landless Sukumbasi
Mhm.
people in the cities and towns. And one of the problems the Nepal government is not able to solve is, I just
Mm.
wonder, have Kanan done any research
Mm.
on this issue? Okay.
Yeah, sure.
All
Good.
right. Make your final thoughts with, and
Yeah.
conclude. Yeah.
Last couple of questions. So I think on Bina's question, yeah, I think this is actually interesting because yeah, most of the landless hill dialects were engaged in Adia in all of our field sites. But I mean, I think whether you consider that an opportunity, I'm not sure. And Krishna, I know you've done much more research on this probably than me. But it's because I wouldn't say Adia is also a very exploitative form of agriculture. It's a very incentiveless form of farming whereby 50% of every unit of investment has to go to the landlord. So I would say I'd say it's a change, a kind of more change in the structure of exploitation. So okay, they're no longer kind of bonded through kind of judge money exchange, but they are still engaged in quite an exploitative form of agriculture. So yeah, so I think whether you frame that as an opportunity is again, I think Krishna, your own work, like your recent book with David on Dalits in Nepal, Dalits in transition, I think probably I'm hoping covers these issues. Maybe we can talk about that later. Um, and Councillor Lachia Gurung's question about, yeah, Sukhumvasi, it's an interesting question because I think they're quite a distinct group. So these are people who essentially are completely landless. So they don't have any titles. A lot of the people who I talk about as being landless are not Sukhumvasi. So they still own a plot for their house and maybe a kitchen garden, but their agricultural land is basically um, agricultural land is, farm, but it belongs to other people. So, yeah, it's a huge issue. We haven't done research on it in particular, but again, this is the kind of question that needs to be addressed in a future land reform. And it's also finding land so some of the people who should be first priority to get land should be so-called Sukumbasi, those who literally have nothing, who don't, and when you don't have land, you're in this sort of cycle of poverty. You can't get documents, can't get citizenship papers, you can't, so. It's yeah, so I think that should be a huge priority, but I haven't done much research on it.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, in terms of Dalits benefiting
Yes.
from the migration so that they can work on the land,
Hmm.
we have had some observations,
Hmm.
David and I together.
Hmm.
Obviously, Dalits are benefiting, and also this idea of Adiya rather than
Hmm.
Adiya, I think is going away, and there's some
Yeah, yeah.
new pattern of sharecroppings are emerging where the tenants get more.
Yeah, yeah, like a ticker system kind of,
yeah,
yeah.
as the
Yeah.
barren land also is increasing anyway.
Mm.
This is something for us to discuss in coming
Yeah,
days.
definitely.
It's been fantastic talk and within time,
Thanks.
and we had fantastic participants. Thank you for coming and
Thanks so much.
engaging. Thank you, Fraser, for your time. I just would like to make a couple of announcements. As you know, we would like to continue this discussion. But we also wanted to understand what you think, of his use, format, and so on. So we are going to launch a survey very soon.
Mhm.
So you'll be receiving